number days, 50b, top of the page. 3 lines down. Okay. You can't collect from mishubodim. Mishubodim are the article calls them encumbered properties. Not exactly sure what that means. You can't collect from a property that is not currently owned by. Let's rephrase this. You can't use a lien to collect if there's property that's available to collect without a lien. So if the borrower has property that he already sold, and he also has property that's still in his domain, it hasn't been sold yet. You collect from the property that's in his domain first. So what's the story if the guy has given away his property instead of selling it, he's given it away as a gift? Is that also called mishubodim or not? Is the reason why the rabbi said collect specifically from free property before you collect the property that's been sold, because of the potential loss for the buyer of the property. By a gift, he never had a loss because he didn't take any loss. So then, therefore, you can collect equally from free assets as well as assets with a lien that have been sold. Or do we say the truth is that every matana, every gift is sort of like a sale, because if you think about it, there's a reason why he's giving him a gift, and therefore, if not for the fact that he's getting that benefit, he would not have been. The gift is a the gift is a what do you call it? It's a barter for that benefit that he wants. So he's bartering the benefit for the gift, so to speak. And that's sort of like a sale. Okay. And therefore it's like a loss of the buyer. Amarle Marchisha Braid of Chizdel Ravashi. So Marchisha, the son of Rav Chisda, says to Ravashi, Toshma. Let's examine this. We're on 50b, about a quarter of the way down the page. Just a brief review. The discussion here is when you have a borrower someone borrowed money, and he can't afford to pay back, and he owns property, and he also sold some of his previous property. The halacha is you collect the property that's still in his domain as opposed to the property that he sold, even if he sold all his good property and the only thing he has left is the poorest of properties. That would be called ziburitz. The question is, what happens if instead of selling his property, he gave it as a gift? Is the reason for this law because the buyer of a property is going to be taking a loss? So therefore, we say collect first from the property that the borrower has before he sold. I'm sorry, that he has currently, or do we say that? Do we say that you can collect equally from the assets the borrower had and the assets he gave away as a gift, or do we require or no base? Yeah. Okay, Toshma.
I'm sorry, Rabbi. Page number in English. It's a little early for me.
50b.
50b, and where? Which line?
50b. About a quarter of the way down the page. First one line is Chizda.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's try to examine this question. Again, the question is whether or not a property gifted qualifies for this rabbinic exemption. In general, there's an exemption if somebody bought property from a borrower and the borrower has remaining properties. We collect from the remaining properties first and not from the buyer's property, even though it's under lien. And the question is, what would be the halacha with regard if he gave it away as a gift? Is it the same story or is it not? Toshma, Shchim Rosh Amar Tnuma Sayim Zuz Leplaining. There's somebody who's dying. He says, give 200 zuz to somebody, to Reuven, let's say. Gimel Me'ez Zuz Leplaining. And 300 zuz give to Shimon. The Dalad Me'ez Zuz Leplaining. And 400 zuz give to Levi. Ein Omer, we don't say Kol HaKodim Mishtar Zochel. We don't say that Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, because Reuven was before Levi, so Reuven, if somebody comes to collect, they'll collect from Reuven last. We say they collect from everybody equally. Therefore, if it turns out there's actually a debt, he collects equally from all three. Avlam Amar, if he says, Tenuma Sayin Zuz Leplani, give 200 zuz to Reuven, and then afterwards, V'achar of Leplani, afterwards give 300 to Levi and 400 to Yehudah. Then we do say, whoever came first in the document, in this case it would be Reuven, he acquires it first. If a debt comes out, go him an achar and collect from the last one first. If it's more than 400 zuz of Levi, so then you collect also from Shimon up to 300. If Shimon doesn't have enough, you collect 200 of Reuven. Okay. And the Brisa says, "Va'afagav dekama beininis ubas ziburis." Presumably, this would be the case, even though Reuven, let's say, got beininis property, and Levi, the last one, got ziburis property. The debt collector would collect first from ziburis before beininis. The ziburis got beininis legovi shmamina. What do we see from here? This story seems to be about gifts. Right, we have a person that's about to die, terminally ill, he's on his deathbed. He's giving out gifts effectively. And what do we see from here? We see that there is priority in gifts. In other words, Levi, the last one, got 400 zuz of useless property, and Reuven gets 200 zuz of good property. Now, typically, a Bachayv gets mid-range property. But we force the Bachayv here to take the poorest property because that's the last thing that remains. Here is clear evidence that a gift is treated equally to a sale in terms of its encumberment. You collect from the ziburis, not from the baininus. Shmamina, we see from here. We see from here that the rabbis did create this same rabbinical enactment with regard to gift. Together? Mm-hmm. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to have to try to unravel this. Not necessarily. Okay, what are we talking about? Actually, these weren't gifts. He owed this amount of money in debt. He actually borrowed 200, 300, and 400 zuz. So he was paying back his debts. Gemara says, he said, give it as a gift. Gemara says, no, he didn't mean tenu as a gift. He said, tenu b'chayvi. Gift it to him, meaning pay back my debt. Okay, so Gemara says, if that's the case, we have a different set of rules. If a guy pays back 3 people the same day, the question here is not which one he paid up first. The question is, which debt came first? That's the real question, because the determining factor of who is going to be pushed to the back of the line is the last creditor. So if a guy borrows money in 2005 and 2008 and 2010, the guy with 2005, he collects first. 2008 collects second. 2010 collects last. So why is it? It's not dependent on whether he says pay up 2010, 2008, 2005. It doesn't make a difference. It depends on when the debt was issued. So the Gemara says, let's see whose document was first. The Gemara says, like a shtar, there was no document. But whoever comes first in the document, the Gemara says, we're not talking about who came first in the original loan. What we're talking about is the guy wrote out a document that says pay Reuven, pay Shimon, pay Levi. That document is called a shtar pekanta. It's a command document. And that has the order. Okay. That's the first resolution. The Gemara offers another resolution. We're talking about a gift as well. It's not difficult. Okay, this is an interesting workaround here. Just trying to explain this. So it happens is you have Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, right? Reuven gets 200, Levi gets 300. And let's say, for argument's sake, that Reuven and Shimon, 200 and 300, get Baininus, and Levi gets Ziburis. Okay? So now the Gemara is positing what happens actually is as follows. The creditor comes to collect. These were all gifts. The creditor comes to collect. He has 500 zuz to collect. So he goes, who has 500 zuz? He wants Baininus. He wants premium property. So he goes ahead and collects 200 from Reuven and 300 from Shimon, which are both Baininus. What if the Mishnah says the last one collects? You're right. Because what happens now is that Reuven and Shimon go ahead and collect Levi's property. Because Levi is the last debtor. So therefore so effectively Levi loses out. But it could be that that the one who receives the gift is not protected by this general rule, collect from the last one. And therefore the creditor comes ahead and collects from the earlier ones, which would be Reuven and Shimon. Collects his 500 coins. Because they have Baininus and he wants Baininus and he's entitled to get Baininus. And because they were a gift, not a sale, he is not forced to go to the last one in the line, which would be Levi. However, effectively the loss will be Levi's loss. Because Levi's field is now going to be confiscated by the earlier gifts. They have a lien on Levi's field. Together? That's the proposal. So when we talk about the last one has to pay, we don't mean the last one has to pay, we mean the last one has to lose. It's actually the first two that have to pay. But they don't end up losing as much because they can collect from the last guy. And the third proposal is this is sort of a cheap answer. The Gemara posited initially that all the property was not equal. Reuven and Shimon got Baininus, or Reuven got Baininus and Shimon and Levi got Ziburis. We're saying no, it could be that everybody got equal property. If everybody got equal property, then yeah, the truth is that you go to the last one first. As if there was an advantage to go to the first one because he has better properties, and you go to the first one. But no, we're talking about the properties all equal. It's all Baininus or it's all Ziburis or all this. Doesn't make a difference. Okay. So now we get to the next category. The next Gemara is a little complicated. I guess all the Gemara here is complicated. It's a short Gemara, but it's not so easy. Okay. As follows. We learned in the Mishnah that I'll just go right into the Gemara. I'll explain to you the Gemara. We'll see the Gemara inside afterwards in a moment. So there's general rules as follows. The sort of the theory behind collecting from a Shubadim, right, is the whole theory of how the system works is that you're supposed to be able to predict whose property might be collected. And you're supposed to be vigilant of that possibility. So you buy somebody's field, you want to check his debts. Make sure you don't end up in a compromised situation. For that reason, because the whole idea is that you sort of check this stuff, it's like public record before public records existed. The idea is that only a document that has only a debt that's documented, because that's a debt that everyone knows about. A debt that's not documented can't collect from Mishabadim. Okay, now one of the rules was you can't collect from Mishabadim either things that are either not written or not set, or both. So for example, Mishabadim, encumbered property. For example, a husband has a commitment to support his children and his wife if he dies. That commitment is not set. It's not fixed, right? It's an indefinite commitment. And therefore, it's impossible to protect yourself from an indeterminate claim. It's not indefinite, it's indeterminate. And therefore, how much money do you have to pay to support your kids? As much as they need. Until when? Effectively, until they become adults, which is too far in advance to be able to predict exactly what it will be. So therefore, because it's an indeterminate amount, it's considered, we say that you can't collect from Mishabadim. Similarly, we had this guy who invested in a property that turned out to have been stolen. He's allowed to collect his investments from the thief who sold him the property. He can only collect from the thief from Bnei Chorin, property that's not encumbered. But encumbered property he can't collect for. Why can't he collect? Two possibilities. Either because it's not written down. It was never written down that there was the guy invested in property, or because it's not a determinate amount. Okay, the Gemara will address these 2 points here. One, which is that they're not written. The other point is that they're not determined. So my time, what's the reason? Amar Ula. So I told you the Gemara will go through each opinion on its own. Amar Ula, Amar Shlagish. Ula says in Amar Shlagish, because they're not written down. Amar Reb Abba Ula, so Reb Abba says to Ula, if a person supports his kids, right, the obligation of a husband to support his daughters and his wife. The daughters, by the way, have primary responsibility for support more than the sons, and that's because the sons are more capable to fend for themselves. The command ksivi dami, these things are written in every ksuba, and everybody knows about them. Uktani ein matzian. And the Mishnah says you do not collect from mishbadim. So in other words, according to Ula, the critical rule is like this: you want to collect from encumbered property, your obligation must be written down. If you put an investment into what you thought was what you didn't realize, what you did not realize was a stolen property, so you're not entitled because it's not written down. Says the Gemara that what about supporting your kids and your wife? Supporting your wife and your kids, that is something that's not written down. And yet the halacha is that we supporting your wife and kids is written down because it's in the ksuba and everybody knows about it, and yet you still collect only from Bnei Chorin, from property that has no lien. Encumbered property cannot be collected from to supply to pay, make these payments. So Gemara says, Amalei hasam ikar hachi atkan. So Ula says it's a different reason entirely. The reason behind a investment in a stolen property and the reason behind the payment for support for wife and daughters is completely different. A wife and daughters, who require you to support your wife and daughters? The rabbis. So the rabbi said only from Bnei Chorin, not from Mishubadim. And that's a different reason than a property that was stolen. One second. Okay. Together. And Rav Asi says the name of Rav Yechanan. He gives the same reason. The reason in the Mishnah can't be because it's not written down, because support of a wife and daughters is written down, and yet you still don't collect from Bnei Chorin. Amar Leis, he says no, he wasn't impressed with the question. He says Hachi Atkan. The reason for support of a wife and daughters, why it only collects from Bnei Chorin free property, but not from Mishubadim, encumbered property. Because that's the way the rabbis decreed. It's considered written down to collect from free property, but it's not considered written down to collect from encumbered property. Rav Chanina says, he gives a different reason completely, which is that it is not a determined amount. Okay, so the Gemara wants to know as follows. What is the critical component of Rav Chanina? He says that in order to collect from encumbered property, what is necessary? Is it necessary to have a determined amount, a fixed amount? Or is it necessary that it has to be not only fixed, but also written down? So both of them are requirements. So Mara says, Toshma, let's examine this. To itmar mi shemes v'niach shtei boros uben. Okay, the general rule here is as follows: you have daughters; they're entitled to take 1/10 of the assets for their marriage. So you have 2 daughters and a son. In this case, the inheritor is the son. First one gets married; she takes 10% of the assets. She gets married. Then the son dies without children. Now, who inherits the son that dies without children? The father. But the father is also dead, obviously. So the first part of the story was that he died. And therefore, who inherits the father? His daughters now. So the daughters are getting the inheritance. Now, daughter number 1, she already pulled 10% for her marriage. Daughter number 2 didn't get married yet. The halacha is they split the assets equally. And daughter number 2 loses out. Okay, the Kadma Rishon of Adulthood, daughter number 1 takes Isur Nechasim, 1/10 of the assets to get married. And daughter number 2 did not have a chance to get married before the son died. Amr V'Yechlan says, Shnia Vitra, she loses out. For Amr Rav Chanina says, Gedola Mizu Amru. We've said even something. We've said something even more important than this. Matzian leparnasa ve'ematzian lemizainis. Parnasa meaning giving a significant payment for a daughter's wedding is such an obligation that it collects from mishubadim, encumbered property, which is far more important than mizainis, support, which does not collect from encumbered property. And therefore, how can you tell me that she loses it if the obligation is, in other words, it's such a strong obligation to pay for a wedding that it even collects from encumbered property? So how can you argue to me? How can you argue to me that she loses it? She sort of gives it up because the brother dies when it's such a strong obligation. Okay. So we have a question whether or not she loses her 10%. If the brother dies before she got married. Now the Gemara asks, to make its kaitza, mechtav like siba, become itzia. Parnasa, getting married, supporting a woman for her marriage, daughter for marriage, is a fixed amount. It's a fixed amount of money that he's obligated to give. Mechtav like siba, but it's not written down. And we see that you can take out of mishubadim, you can collect with a lien from encumbered property. So this clearly indicates that Rabbi Chanina would not require that it be written down. And the Gemara says no proof. Shani parnasa kimin de isle kala kaman diksiva dami, because everybody knows that a person is obligated to support his daughters to help marry them off. So therefore, it's as if it's written down. And it's as if it's written down, then there's no proof to the original question, which was, according to Rav Chanina, the question is, does it need to be both determined and written, or determined alone is enough? Determined meaning a fixed amount of money. Okay, command of Sivadam means as if it's written down. Okay, 1 second.
More important to provide the dowry than it is to provide the sustenance.
Correct. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's more important, but I would say that it's more of a binding obligation. And the reason for that is pretty simple. The reason is because the dowry is sort of a fixed amount, and the whole idea is to protect the buyers. Okay. In other words, there's sort of the whole today we have public records, so everything is about the public record, right? You do a title search and somebody goes down to the whatever. Now they do it virtually, whatever it is. Some of us you have to still go down to, and there's a big room with a bunch of files, and you have to go through and see what the story is. That's what that's what our system is based on, the belief that a buyer will do due diligence, and we define due diligence by recording every entry in a public record. Before the days of public record, there was sort of a virtual public record. It's funny as it sounds. In other words, the sort of the rumor mill was the public record, and things that entered the rumor mill were public record. Things that didn't enter the rumor mill were in public record. And the other factor sort of is how much, what's the amount? So it also has to be a fixed amount. So we know you have to support your kids, but specifically your daughters and wife, but we don't know how much because it's an indeterminate amount. So that's why it's more important for us to be, the dowry is much easier to fix. The rumor mill knows this is what it costs to marry off a girl. This is the lien that's on the assets. Whereas okay. Okay, next one. Next question. 1 second. I'm just borrowing your arts for a second, if you don't mind. It's a little confusing here because the Gemara's questions are not in order. Yeah, okay. I got confused here last night when I was preparing this. Okay, so this question is not the Gemara has a standing open question of Rav Chanina. According to Rav Chanina, what's the critical factor? Is it a determined amount of debt? It is $10,000, not a penny more or less. Or is it A, a fixed amount, $10,000, and B, written down? That's the question according to Rav Chanina. Hold on to the question for a few minutes, and now let's go back to Ula. Ula's argument was, what is critically necessary to be able to collect from encumbered property? It is written down. It has to be written down. So Gemara has a question on Ula. Most of Rav Huna bar Menayach had the following question on Ula. Meisu ben Isayam. Okay, it's an interesting scenario there. So what's going on? We have a story as follows. A little bit of background first. There's a fellow who married a woman who already had a daughter from a previous marriage. So she's getting married. The new husband is not obligated to support her daughter. There is no obligation for him to provide child support to the daughter of the woman he marries, who's not his daughter. However, presumably you might expect that she's getting married now, right? So she wants him to support her. So they make a condition. They say you're going to support this girl for 5 years. In the marriage, he commits not only to marrying the woman, but to supporting her daughter, which is not his daughter, for 5 years. The halacha is, obviously, he has to support her for 5 years. Not only that, if he dies, the condition was not while they're married. The condition was you're going to support her for 5 years. Therefore, if he dies, she collects from Mishubadim. 5 years of support is minimal. It's a fixed amount of money. Let's say it's $10,000, $5,000, whatever it is. You have to give $5,000. Doesn't make sense if the guy's alive or dead. That collects from encumbered property, from Mishubadim. What happens if she has 2 daughters? Okay, one of the daughters is actually his daughter. So what does it mean? She got married, she had a daughter. She got divorced, or her husband died. Then she got remarried, and she had a daughter with her new husband. Then she got divorced and remarried to the same husband. So she enters the marriage with 2 kids. One that belongs to the husband, one that's from a different husband. The husband's obligated to support his own daughter. There's no need for a condition. However, he's not obligated to support her daughter from a different marriage. So that's why she puts the 5-year clause into the marriage. Then he dies. What happens? B'nai Sayam, his own biological daughter, Mizainis Minachasim Minecharin. She collects her mizainis only from property that is not encumbered. However, the daughter from the previous marriage, she's more privileged than that. She can collect from encumbered property. Because she's like a creditor. What are we talking? Okay. Now, according to Ula, they're both written, presumably they're both written down equally. Committed to both to support both of them. So what's the difference? Mara says, when we talk about that they made a binding agreement. 1 second. According to Ula, 1 second. Hold on 1 second. Yeah. Okay. So now according to Ula, the Gemara's question is, you see here that the obligation to support your daughter for the fact that he took on an obligation to support his daughter for 5 years, not his daughter, her daughter for 5 years, it obligates him and it collects from a Shubadim, even though it's not written down. So the Gemara says no, but there was a kinyan, meaning it was written down. Okay, if it was written down, presumably it was written down equally for the biological daughter as well. Why is she different? The Gemara says, he committed to supporting her daughter, but not his own daughter. The Gemara says, my Pisco, what makes you think that that's the case? In other words, you're making a presumption here. It's sort of a weird presumption that they get remarried. She asks 5 years of support for her own daughter, but not for his daughter. Like, well, why would you think that? Presumably whatever happened to one happened to the other. So Gemara says, "Bas ishtoy dehavoy b'shas kinyan mahani la kinyan, bita dehavoy b'shas kinyan la mahani la kinyan." Okay, so the Gemara proposes as follows: when they got married, the Gemara presumes as follows: so he's remarrying her. She comes in with a daughter. But there's only one daughter so far, her daughter. Then they have a child, which is his daughter. That child gets from Bnei Chora, not from encumbered property. So, okay, because the Gemara presumes that they had the daughter after they got married. Their daughter was born after the marriage. So therefore, they couldn't make a kinyan to make the obligation because the daughter obviously wasn't born yet. So the Gemara says, okay, hold on. Mila Askinan, what is that? It would seem that the Brisa could be even a scenario to have a Travai B'Shas Kinyan, where they were both alive at the time of the Kinyan. Like I explained before, where they were previously married and divorced. Be'echidami, had it happened, the Girsha V'Hadra, where she had a daughter from a different marriage, then they got married, had a daughter, got divorced, and then got remarried. So they have their daughter and her daughter. And presumably they made a kinyan for both of them. Okay, his daughter, their daughter, that he's obligated to support anyway. So you can't make a kinyan to obligate to support. You can't obligate yourself to support her. You're already obligated, and therefore the kinyan doesn't work. However, bas ishtay, your wife's daughter that you're not obligated to support, so then you can make a kinyan. You can obligate yourself. So the Gemara says, hold on, but he migragara, to the contrary. So his daughter, he's obligated to support anyway. So therefore, that makes it worse that he cannot obligate himself again because he's already obligated. That's sort of counterintuitive. In other words, if the obligation is so strong that you're already obligated, surely you should be able to double obligate yourself. So the Gemara changes. Gemara gives an alternative reason. The concern here is because he's obligated to support her anyway. We're concerned that right before he died, he gave her bags of cash. Recall, we learned about this in Subas, came up a little bit in Yavamis also. So bags of cash. Therefore, we do not allow you to collect from Mishubadim encumbered property because we're concerned that maybe you're actually not entitled to collect. Why would she not be entitled to collect? Because she got bags of cash. We together? Okay. Now we go back to Rav Chanina again. So we just took a Yidis from Rav Chanina, went detour to Ula, and now we go back to Rav Chanina. What did Rav Chanina say? The reason for why you collect from Mishubadim is because it is a fixed amount. The question is, does a fixed amount also need to be written down or not? Toshma, let's examine this. Amr of Nasan. Rav Nasan says, Amasai, when is this true? Bizman shekodam mekre shel sheni l'shvacha shel rishon. Okay, 1 second. Okay, as follows. So here's the proof. What happened was, the robber, let's say, the robber will say he has 3 fields. Okay, field 1, 2, and 3. He sold number 1 to Reuven. Reuven went ahead and made this. He sold field number 1 to Reuven. Then what happened was he sold field number 2 to Shimon, and field number 3 was sold to Levi. Okay, sure enough, field number 1 was actually stolen. Reuven now, after all 3 fields have been stolen, Reuven puts a massive investment. He develops the property, and sure enough, the original owner comes and he takes the field back. So now Reuven's allowed to collect from the robber, except that the robber's field number 2, field number 3 are owned by somebody else now. Can't collect it. That's because the investment. The sale of field number 2 and 3 preceded the investment of Reuven into his property. What happens if Reuven buys field number 1, puts in this massive investment, then field number 2 and field number 3 are stolen. Are sold. Then the original owner for field number 1 comes and takes back his field that he owns. So then Reuven is allowed to collect from field number 2 and field number 3. Why is this? It's a fixed amount, right? He's already put the investment in. They should have known better. Should have realized that if field number 1 is going to be stolen, recourse will be on them. Their property is leaned to that investment. Okay. So Amr of Nosan, Amos, when is this true? Where the sale of field number 2 and 3 to Shimon and Levi precedes the investment of Reuven. First, all the fields were sold, then Reuven invested. Reuven cannot collect his investment costs from Shimon and Levi. But if Reuven bought field number 1, made the massive investment, then what happened was field number 2 and 3 were sold. You do collect from encumbered property. Reuven could collect from those fields. Alma, we see from here. Mishum delay kodim. One second. Who? The concern here is the moment that they bought the fields. Is it a fixed in other words, is the amount of investment going to be fixed at that point, or is it still indeterminate? If the investment happens later, it's indeterminate. There's no way for you to know to protect yourself. But if you bought the field after the investment was made, you should have known better. We see from here that it does not need to be written down. I think Gemara says, you're right, Tanoihi, it's Machlokes Tanam. In other words, this question we have in Rav Chanina is actually subject to Tanakh debate. What's the debate? The Tanya we learned, Ein Metzin Lachilas Paris, Lashach, Karsim wasn't Isha Abonis, Menchosim Shabonim, Netikin Arlam. The Fisha Ein Ksuvin. The first opinion says the reason why you don't collect is because they're not written down. Amr Rav Yosi v'himatik and Arlam Yesh Bezu v'haloi Ein Ksuvin. And Rav Yosi explains, no, the reason is not because they're written down. The reason is because they're not fixed. And therefore, that's sort of the question is whether they need to be fixed and whether they need to be written down in addition to fixed. And this brisa clearly indicates that it's a machlokes. Okay, I would love to continue. 1 second, hold on. No, let's see the next. Let's see. There's something to gain by seeing the next tomorrow, although we'll have to review it again tomorrow. Okay. So we saw in the Mishnah that if somebody finds a lost object, he does not make a shvuah. What exactly happened? So I found Jules' wallet. Jules opens the wallet. He sees $100 bill and he says, "What do you mean? There were 100 of these. You're only giving it back to me with 1." So this is a case of ma'adim b'miktzas. And the halacha, however, the risk factor here is if we're going to require me to make a shvuah, nobody will ever return a lost object again, because there's always this massive risk factor. So therefore, somebody finds a lost object, does not make a shvuah. And now we get to a Gemara that appears to disagree with this Mishnah. Omer Yitzchak says, Shnei kisin kshurin matzasali. I returned a wallet, and the guy says, no, there were 2 wallets that were tied together. And the finder says, I've only found 1 wallet. Nishba, he makes an oath. Which seems to run exactly counter to our Mishnah. Shnei shivarim kshurin matzasali. I found 2 tied oxen together. I only found 1 ox. He doesn't make an oath. My time. Even though you thought you tied the 2 oxen together, well. Tie 2 oxen together and go see what happens. That doesn't necessarily mean that they'll stay tied together forever. So there's no contradiction. Therefore, the finder, the one who lost it says they were tied, and the finder says they weren't tied. It's not necessarily a contradiction. If they were oxen, obviously they can sort of untie themselves. So therefore, he doesn't make a shvuah. My time, a shvarim could get untied. Kisin a wallet, it's not going to get untied. Shnei shvarim shurin matzasa. The loser says, you found 2 oxen tied together. I found one and I found both and I gave you back 1. You make an oath. And the Gemara is the obvious question here. If Rabbi Yitzchak does Rabbi Yitzchak disagree with the Mishnah? The Mishnah says exactly the opposite. Okay, I have 30 seconds here. We'll just summarize the Gemara's answer. Okay, in brief summary, the reason why I'm summarizing the Gemara's answer is because it'd be easier not to know the Gemara's response without going through the response, because it's not an intuitive response. If you look at the Rashi and Taisus here, you'll see it's not simple at all. The summary response is that according to this opinion of Yitzchak, you need a definitive argument, and the Mishnah is talking about a non-definitive argument. If it's a Tainas Shema, he's not sure what he found. It might have been $10,000. Then you don't make a shvua. But if he says for certain there was $10,000, then you do make a shvua. And that's sort of how it resolves the mission. See, the rest of the Gemara is not so intuitive. We'll see that tomorrow.